The 2024 NBA trade deadline is one of the weirdest ones that I can honestly remember over the last decade or so, when I've been really locked into what's happening at the trade deadline, especially for content like this. Feels like a very, very strange January to February in the NBA right now.
Hold on. Can we just talk for a second? While editing this, I just realized I said I've been covering the trade deadline for a decade. That's not true. I haven't been doing YouTube for a decade. Two, that made me sound like I was about 50 years old, like I've been covering the trade deadline since like the 80s or something. Anyway, carry on with your day.
Now, there's a lot of different reasons for this, but let's just go through some of the deals really quickly. So we talked the other day about the James Harden trade, how well that has worked out for the Clippers, and that's kind of like our biggest star move so far, other than if you want to count Pascal Siakam over the top of that one. And it's a trade that has worked out wonderfully, but it's one that happened way before the deadline, so it doesn't really have anything to do with the actual trade deadline itself. And then we have the OG Anunoby trade, which again has worked out wonderfully for the team that made the biggest move, in this case being the New York Knicks. And that is a deal that we don't really see a ton of. Typically on a year-to-year basis, we're seeing, stars getting moved or role player 3-and-D guys getting moved. But the in-between, the elite defender that can also shoot, create, score a little bit for you, those kinds of guys don't get moved very often, and I think is an indicator of where we are right now at this particular trade deadline. And then of course we have the Siakam trade as well, with the thread between OG and Siakam being not only former Raptors, but also impending free agents. And I think that's one thing that is kind of driving some of the rumors that we're seeing, some of the moves that we've seen, and also just kind of this weird feeling around the deadline. And that is the 2024 free agency class as well as the draft class, because Siakam and OG Anunoby are two of the biggest guys in the free agency class. However, both New York and Indiana obviously feel confident that they're going to be able to retain those guys in free agency, which is why they made the move in the first place. And apart from those two guys, it's not a very strong free agency class. Typically, over the last handful of years, maybe not so much in the last year or two, but prior to that, free agency has seen a ton of different stars change teams. I mean, you go back to 2019, half the All-NBA guys of that season changed teams in the offseason. That's not the kind of free agency class that we have this year. And so I think there are more teams, one, that are willing to make impending free agent trade moves because they feel like there's nobody else that is really going to be able to take these guys away, because teams weren't really planning on a big free agency class because they knew in advance it wasn't going to be a good one. So there's less competition, especially if you're the re-signing team. And also, if there isn't a big upgrade available in free agency, and maybe there will be in 2025, why don't you go ahead and make what is the equivalent of your free agency move now if you're the Knicks or the Pacers? And the, generally speaking, lack of at least top tier talent in that class, I think, is definitely incentivizing some of these teams, in this case, Indiana, New York, to make those kinds of moves. And also at the same time, kind of weirdly deterring other teams from making moves around the fringes if they feel like maybe things won't go well in New York and Indiana, they still have a chance to get those guys. But I think that's the primary reason that, one, we haven't maybe seen as many trades or as many rumors, and also why those two teams in particular made those moves. One of the other themes we've seen so far at the deadline is teams being a little bit more willing to make moves earlier on in the year than we normally would. Now, of course, the Harden thing was a special circumstance, but that was an extremely early, star trade in terms of within the season. Also, the OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam trades, typically, the week of the deadline is really when we start to see some pieces moving, but those teams made moves much earlier. And I think part of that is teams are maybe becoming more and more aware of where they are within the standings, maybe a little bit earlier on, and really trying to make sure that they're not putting themselves in the direct middle and trying to go in one direction or another. And I think in the case of both of these teams in the East, Indiana and New York, that made these big moves, they feel like there's an opportunity for them potentially at the top of the Eastern Conference, whereas in the West, maybe it's going to be a little bit more difficult to truly break through. The East feels like they have a couple of really good teams, but maybe not a ton of depth outside of those, top 3 or so teams. And then really the last piece of this just feeling like a weird deadline is, apart from Siakam, OG, and Harden, it doesn't feel like there's a ton of big names out there and available. We've become very accustomed to, over the last couple of seasons, having a ton of, big time stars, or at least all-star caliber guys available at the trade deadline. And it doesn't seem like there's as many rumors around that this year, which gives it a little bit of a different feel and a different vibe. Now, there's a couple of different reasons for that. One, a lot of those guys guys have already been traded over the last couple of seasons. And so obviously, I mean, we see teams, or players, I should say, making multiple trade requests multiple seasons in a row. I mean, that does happen. Just look at James Harden. But like Kyrie got moved last year, KD got moved last year. We thought that maybe Donovan Mitchell was going to be a guy that was going to get moved. That hasn't happened. Doesn't seem like it will. The Trae Young thing has been weird, but it doesn't seem like there's actually going to be anybody that's going to pull the trigger on that. And so when that isn't the case, then you have the deadline kind of being about DeJounte Murray, Zach LaVine, guys that are very good, but not quite on the level of some of the players that we typically see available, which generally speaking leads to a quieter deadline. And then the other part of that as well, and one of the things that makes a player like LaVine particularly difficult to move, is some of the new rules that we now have in place with the second apron, which I'm not going to go into and explain in super in depth in this video here. But basically it means that if you are going to spend big on players for right now over the next couple of seasons, you can kind of pick 2 guys, and then the rest of the roster, they're not going to be minimum salary players, but it's difficult at this point when you look into what the future of the league is going to be to have 3 or 4, $35+ million guys. It's just very, very difficult with the way some of the new rules are going to kick in terms of being restrictive to help build your team. And if you're looking at someone like Zach LaVine being added to your roster, I think that's one of the main reasons that, 1, it's hard for him to get moved, and 2, if you're not getting a true all-star, all-NBA guy, I think teams are a little bit more hesitant to make moves at this particular deadline, and there's a reason why LaVine might not get moved, and DeJounte Murray also might not get moved because he's got a new big extension coming up as well. And then the other reason that we don't see a lot of star trades so far, at least, this is still pre-deadline, this recording is that the contending teams have kind of made their moves and don't really have a ton of assets. Like if Cleveland wanted to trade Donovan Mitchell tomorrow, their options are not better than what they traded away for Donovan Mitchell a couple of seasons ago. Milwaukee made their move by trading for Damian Lillard. They have no assets. The Lakers are extremely limited in their assets because of some moves they made last year and in years prior. Miami is a little bit limited as well in terms of their draft picks. Same thing with Philadelphia. These teams, Boston's the same way. They made the Drew Holiday move. These teams that typically would be in the market for a big addition don't really have the assets, which again is I think how you end up with OG Anunoby in New York and Indiana getting Pascal Siakam, because those are teams that had assets that felt like they still had some room to improve and were able to make it work, whether it be salary wise or otherwise. And so all those things in combination bring together a deadline that definitely feels strange. If you feel like maybe there's not as much stuff going on, not as much rumors, it's not in your head. It's definitely a thing this year. And I think there's a ton of different reasons for it that we've talked about throughout the video. But having said all that, if there's one thing that I have learned in however many years I've been making YouTube videos about the NBA, it is to never underestimate the trade deadline and the offseason's ability to, 1, surprise us, and 2, kind of not necessarily force, but I guess force is the right word, force some of these teams to start making some decisions. Like when you have an actual deadline you have to make something happen by, all of a sudden stuff can get crazy pretty quickly. So I'm not necessarily saying that all these reasons are going to mean that we're not going to have any other big deals at the deadline as we get closer. That's definitely still a possibility. Do not underestimate the NBA's ability to surprise us. This is the best content league in the world for a reason. Like there's always something crazy that can happen on a day-to-day basis. But right now, it definitely feels like a quieter deadline, and especially in comparison to some of the deadlines we've had over the last couple of seasons, a very, very weird one.